based on the five aggregates, then or maybe not. No, maybe this is intelligible in itself. Okay, now there's a difference between the view of a self and the conceit I am. The view of a self is somewhat coarser. That is, it takes the form of holding some conceptual formulation that I am this, I am that, this is myself, this is my real identity. And so one formulates a distinct view of oneself, a kind of theoretical position regarding the self in relation to the five aggregates. I'm one of the five aggregates, or I'm the owner of the five aggregates, or the self is inside the five aggregates, or the self is like some great cosmic entity that contains the five aggregates, that there's some kind of substantial, permanent, essential identity, which is my true self. That is the view of a self, and that is eliminated by the first stage of realization, the stage of stream enterer. But even though that view of self is eradicated, even for the non-returner, there is a subtle idea of I that hangs around the five aggregates, even though the non-returner doesn't identify any of the five aggregates as being myself. But it just is some kind of subtle sense that there is an I here. One sutta that occurs in the Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 22, number 89. It's the sutta spoken by a monk named Khemaka. He compares this to the fragrance of a flower. So we don't say that the fragrance of the flower should be identified with the petals or the inside, what is the inner part of a flower called? Stamen. Well, there's the stamen and the pistils, but the whole inside is. Anybody have a flower garden? No flower lovers? Okay, we'll call so we don't identify the fragrance with the petals, the stamen, the pistils. Pericarp? No, the pericarp is part of the heart. Or with the stamen, pistils, the leaves. So we don't identify the fragrance with any part of the flower, but yet the fragrance hangs around and emanates from the flower. And so the non-returner doesn't identify I with any one of the five aggregates, or he doesn't take any position regarding the self in relation to the five aggregates, but some sense of I hangs around the five aggregates. And the same sutta also uses the simile of, this is the way clothes were cleaned in ancient India, and maybe they're still used today in the villages. What they do is to take, they don't have the detergent or the powder like Tide or Fab that you put into the washing machine and it comes out with a nice fragrance. So that to wash the clothes, they would use cow dung, usually a combination of cow dung, ashes, and sand, and first they wash the clothes in the river or out in a well, the water taken from a well, with the ashes and combination of ashes and cow dung. And so it gets rid of all of the dirt and grime and grease from the clothes. But then after the clothes dry, there's still a little bit of the unpleasant fragrance from the cow dung and the ashes. So then what they do is to take the clothes and put them in a casket, and they put a kind of incense at the bottom of the casket and keep the clothes in the casket for a certain time. Then when they open it and take out the clothes, then all of the fragrance or all of the smell from the cow dung and the ashes is gone, and the clothes have a nice, beautiful fragrance from the incense. And so the ashes and cow dung, this is like compared to the knowledge or the wisdom which is used to achieve the stage of non-returner. That wisdom gets rid of all of the ideas of self, all of the theories and views of self. It gets rid of sensual desire and ill will. But there's still a little bit of unpleasant fragrance hanging around the five aggregates, which comes from this conceit, I am. And so then the non-returner continues to cultivate the knowledge of, or the insight into arising and passing away. And as the disciple continues to cultivate that insight, they eliminate the conceit, I am, and with this achieve arahatship. Okay, now I'll ask whether there's any questions on anything covered so far. Wow, you have to stand up. Don't we have more chairs? Yeah, aren't there folding chairs folded in the back?
Oh, that's okay. Bhante?
Yeah.
The question of the five objects of sensual pleasure, instead of course, you said you would rather do objects.
Yeah.
Now, sorry to say this, I looked at the Pali.
Yeah.
It's a kama guna.
It's kama guna, yeah.
Could you explain what guna? Because sometimes kama chanda, there are so many like.
Yeah, I think guna in the very early text simply has the meaning of qualities. So these would be sensual qualities.
The dictionary somehow it says like a strand, something like that. It's not exactly.
You know, I don't know of the word guna being used in the sense of a strand.
Oh.
Maybe they're using strand in relation to kama guna, so you could say strand of sensual pleasure, which again sounds a little bit strange to me.
Okay.
I would say the word guna later takes on, or at least already I think in some of the later texts of the Pali Canon, but especially in the commentaries, it takes on the meaning of excellent qualities, virtuous qualities. But in the earliest text, I don't think it yet has that meaning. I think it could mean simply qualities. It has another meaning in regard to folding something. When one folds something in half, like we say twofold, this would be diguna, or folding something fourfold. This would, actually, diguna, I think, is folding something fourfold. Maybe it's chatuguna.
Thank you.
Did you have? I thought I saw a hand in the back. Okay, Bowe.
Bhante, why a non-returner uses the method of contemplating the impermanence to achieve arahantship instead of the method contemplating into the non-self?
Actually, eventually they'll go into all three characteristics. But I think the arising and passing away here is mentioned just to show like the starting point of the course of insight. But they'll have to achieve insight into all three characteristics.
And another question is, why does a non-returner take, when a non-returner takes rebirth, Bhante said he usually takes rebirth in the formless realm.
No, I said the form realm.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah. Okay, so let us continue, since I want to finish the sutta today. Okay, so then the Buddha sort of just sums up by saying, these states are entirely wholesome and have a wholesome outcome. They are noble, supramundane, and inaccessible to the evil one. The evil one is Mara. Okay, now with section 19, there seems to be a change of topic here. Now the Buddha is going to speak about, this seems to be now reverting to the original topic with which the sutta opens, that is, keeping company with others, associating with others. So now the Buddha is going to explain why a disciple should seek the teacher's company even if he is dismissed, told to go away. And by the teacher here is referring to, this refers to the Buddha. So Ananda asked the Buddha to explain, and the Buddha's explanation seems a little puzzling initially. He says, a disciple should not seek the teacher's company for the sake of discourses, stanzas, and expositions. That is, in order to hear suttas, or to learn new verses, or to get explanations. And why is that? Now the Buddha is speaking specifically for to Ananda. So he says, for a long time, Ananda, you have learned the teachings, remembered them, recited them, examined them with the mind, and penetrated them well by view. But such talk as deals with effacement, as leads to the mind's release, and which leads to complete disenchantment, dispassion, and so on, to nibbana, that is, then he mentions the 10 topics of talk: wanting little, contentment, seclusion, keeping aloof from society, energy, virtue, concentration, wisdom, liberation, knowledge, and vision of liberation. For the sake of such talk, a disciple should seek the teacher's company. Well, it seemed to me, this is why I find this a little puzzling, that when the Buddha speaks about all of these topics, what he's speaking we would call suttas or discourses. So why does he say to Ananda, you shouldn't seek the teacher's company for the sake of discourses, standards, and explanations? Doesn't it seem contradictory? The Buddha is going to give, say, a discourse on wanting little. You'll hear it, then you repeat it to others, and it becomes a sutta. You know, the Buddha doesn't say, I'm going to teach you such and such a sutta. Then he starts speaking. But the Buddha just says, I'm going to speak on say, wanting little, or I'm going to speak on concentration, then he speaks, and those who listen preserve the material, and then they turn it into a sutta. I think maybe that's the case, yeah. Especially because he's speaking to Ananda, and Ananda was what they call the treasurer of the Dhamma, the storekeeper of the Dhamma.
It's like we're reading the sutras all the time, but you don't know.
But he says it's not for the sake of, well, he's saying to Ananda that you, for a long time, you've examined them with the mind and penetrated them well by view. Stephen?
I was wondering, Bhante, if this would be some sort of critique of the Mosaic tradition, the rest of the
Actually, that's a good idea. Could be.
Hi, Bhante.
Okay, Victor? Yeah.
Perhaps he was talking about book knowledge versus insight, maybe? Could that be?
Yeah, that's, I think, pretty much what the other two were saying. Except
Right.
in those days, of course, they didn't have books.
Or,
But
or-
it's just textual knowledge.
Yeah, textual or just
Yeah.
memorization.
Yeah, probably
versus-
so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, let us continue. Okay, now the Buddha introduces, again, this is sort of building up or continuing the line of seeking out company or associating with others closely and intimately in improper ways. So he's speaking about the undoing of a teacher, the undoing of a pupil, and the undoing of one who lives the holy life or the spiritual life in the Buddha's teaching. The word that's translated here as undoing, I see in Pali it's upadava, which actually it's a better translation would be something like the disaster or calamity. The calamity of the teacher, the calamity for a pupil, the calamity for one who leads the holy life. Like the word upadava, it's used to describe things like floods, wildfires, earthquakes, windstorms, destructive windstorms like cyclones. Okay, so how does the teacher's calamity come about? Okay, here we have a teacher who resorts to a secluded resting place, forest, the root of a tree, and so on. Okay, while he is living thus in seclusion, Brahmins and householders from town and country visit him. So he becomes, people start talking about him. Oh, there's this great guru who's living in the Himalayas, in a secluded place, and he's practiced these austerities, he stood on one leg for a long time, or he's fasted for weeks on end, and has long matted hair and just a loincloth and body covered with ashes, and maybe he's able to sit in samadhi sometimes for a couple of weeks, and he has psychic powers. So people come to see him, and then as a result of constant exposure to people chatting, before long, he becomes filled with desire, he succumbs to craving, and reverts to a life of luxury. Well, this happens, I have to say, I mean, even within, well, we'll come to the Buddhist order later. But this seems to be a typical pattern within, I know amongst the Hindu swamis, starting off living in retreat, very austere conditions, They become famous, they get many lay disciples. Then, do you need a dwelling place, master? Oh yes. Then in their enthusiasm, they build a little palace for him. And then, do you need some company at night? Oh yes. And then before long, the palace is filling up with servants, attendants, and bring him sumptuous food. And then the sweet young girls start coming to visit him, awed by his austerities and rumors of psychic powers. Then he becomes attracted to the sweet young girls, and then before long there are scandals breaking out, and then his reputation gets ruined. That's happened so many times. If you remember, if you were there back in those days, 1980s, they called him Bhagavan Rajneesh. Then he changed his name to Osho. Tina is from that generation. Yeah, they always used to see them walk, excuse me? You used to see them walking around, they would always have to wear, yeah, this color clothing. Yeah, sometimes it was bright, sometimes it was a duller, but it was some shade of this. And always a mala with a cameo photograph of Rajneesh inside the locket. And then he was kicked out of India, so he moved to the US, Oregon, and they bought up a whole town. Yeah, Rolls Royces, and his guards had machine guns or rifles. Yeah. Okay, then he is struck down by evil, unwholesome states that defile, bring renewal of existence, ripen in suffering, lead to future birth, old age, and death. So that's how the teacher's calamity comes about. Okay, then how does the pupil's calamity come about? Okay, the pupil imitates his teacher, and then the same thing happens to the pupil. Okay, how does the calamity of one who lives the holy life, that is, who lives the spiritual life or brahmacharya under the Buddha, come about? Okay, here the Tathagata appears in the world, that's the Buddha. Okay, so the Buddha resorts to secluded dwelling places. Okay, then a disciple of the Buddha emulates his teacher's seclusion and resorts to a secluded dwelling place, the forest, and so on. And while he is living thus withdrawn, Brahmins and householders from town and country visit him. And this happens, it's not only the Hindu swamis, but it also happens with Buddhist forest monks. I've heard about this in Thailand, like some of the monks from the Achan Mun tradition. Achan Mun was this very austere, the one who actually revived the forest meditative tradition in Thailand in the early and middle of the 20th century. So he was the teacher of many of the forest masters of the late 20th century, like Achan Mahabor. He was a part-time teacher of Achan Cha, and some of the others, Achan Tate, Achan Lee, and so on. So many of these teachers start off living very austere lives, just deep in the forest with just a little bamboo hut they've built themselves, or their lay followers have built for them. And then they start to attract disciples, more lay followers. And then as roads get built in Thailand coming into the northeast, the forest area, people from Bangkok, the wealthy people, come driving up in buses and cars to visit them. And they say, oh, we can't let our master live in just a little bamboo hut. We have to get a decent dwelling place for him. And so before long, they have a little palace built with, with everything. The master is saying, I don't want that, I don't want that. But please, master, help us get some merit. We are just simple lay people. We want to get some merits. Out of compassion, please accept our new cottage. They'll say, okay, I accept. Then they'll build him maybe a 3-story cottage with a dozen rooms. Okay, and usually I have to say that the forest achans still maintain their austere way of life, but they get given too many gifts, too many offerings, much more than they need. And some do get spoiled. And then it does happen that some fall away. And so here the Buddha describes one who becomes filled with desire, succumbs to craving, reverts to luxury, and then he gets struck down by evil, unwholesome states, and so there comes to be the calamity of one who leads the holy life. And then the Buddha says that the calamity of one who leads the holy life has a more painful result, a more bitter result than the teacher's calamity or the pupil's calamity that is outside the Buddha's teaching. And it even leads to perdition, that is to the lower realms of rebirth. But I have to say, to qualify this, that if somebody is leading the monastic life and they feel that they're overcome by temptation and they don't want to lead it anymore, if they admit their inability and honorably give up the monastic life and return to the lay life, they could still lead a good, wholesome life and even practice very diligently and even reach some of the noble attainments. But I think what the Buddha is speaking about is one who reaps a bitter result, is one who is overcome by the unwholesome states, by desire and craving, and then while still presenting themselves as a monastic, violates the fundamental precepts. And probably what he's speaking about, though the text doesn't mention this, is engaging in sexual relations undercover, while posing as a brahmachari, as one who's leading the celibate life. One is, in actual fact, not leading it. Okay, then the Buddha ends the sutta, again with some, I told you last week that the sutta sometimes has a stern tone to it. So the Buddha says to Ananda and to the other monks, behave towards me with friendliness, not with hostility. That will lead to your welfare and happiness for a long time. And how do disciples behave towards the teacher? With hostility, not with friendliness. That is when the teacher gives them advice compassionately and says, this will lead to your welfare and happiness, do this, practice this. Then the disciples don't listen, don't try to understand, but they just follow their own desires. And so that's how they behave with hostility. And how do they behave towards the teacher with friendliness? That is when the Buddha gives them advice, saying, this is for your welfare and happiness, do this, practice this. Then they listen, they want to listen, they listen carefully, they try to understand, and they put the Buddha's advice into practice. Okay, then the Buddha ends the sutta with a simile, which is not immediately so clear to us because I don't think any of us has practiced making pots. Okay, the Buddha says, I shall not treat you the way a potter treats the raw, damp clay, but repeatedly restraining you, I shall speak to you, or I shall teach you, Ananda. Repeatedly admonishing you, I shall speak to you. The sound core will stand the test. To understand this, I had to rely on the commentary. I'll say what the commentary says is that when the potter is making a pot from clay, when he's forming the pot, he treats it very carefully, very gently, so that he gets the pot, the clay perfectly formed to make the pot. Then he puts the clay, when he gets a number of pots formed, he puts them on a tray and then puts them into the oven and bakes the clay for the clay to turn hard. Then he takes the clay out, or he takes the pots out from the oven. Then he takes a stick and hits the pots. And if the pot is badly formed so that it won't make a good usable pot, it'll break. But if the pot has been properly formed and will be useful, then when he hits it, it will stand up. And so the Buddha treats the pupils the way he treats the baked clay, not the raw clay. So he'll be repeatedly admonishing, repeatedly advising, instructing, restraining the disciples. And those who don't want to take the instructions, those who don't like to be admonished and exhorted, those will turn away and leave. But those who recognize that the Buddha's instructions are given with kindness and compassion out of concern for the well-being of the disciple, they will remain and continue to practice till they become strong and steady. Any quick questions? We'll have a discussion. Okay, Barbara?
Yes, the Buddha himself was given lots of gifts, lots of land,
Yeah.
lots of people around.
Yeah.
Yet he doesn't talk about the way he kept those from toppling him. Now, clearly it's because he was enlightened.
Yeah, yeah.
But is there more than that?
I'm trying
Because
to
he
think.
was, I understand, he allowed, there were people around him. He might go off now and then, but
Yeah.
he was with the people.
Yeah, I think this could be the point that the Buddha is making earlier in the sutta. Let me just find the passage. Yeah, this would be on page 972. In paragraph 6, where the Buddha says that there is this abiding which has been discovered or awakened to by the Tathagata, that is how to enter and dwell in emptiness internally by giving no attention to all signs or to all objects. So while the Tathagata is dwelling in that way, he's visited by monks and nuns, by male and female lay followers, by kings and ministers, by other teachers and their disciples. Okay, and then with a mind leaning to seclusion, tending and inclining to seclusion, delighting in renunciation, with a mind that's altogether done away with concern for things that are the basis for the taints, for the defilements, then he talks to them in a way concerned with dismissing them. So the Buddha has this inner abiding in emptiness to which he can repeatedly return and that's where he takes his delight. And so when he speaks to others, he does so. But because he's, as you put it, he's already gained enlightenment, and he's done away with all of these things that are the basis for the defilements. And so for that reason, the Buddha doesn't get caught up in all of the gifts that he receives. Okay, I think we'll have to end now, and then we'll come back at 12:30, and then we could have some discussion about anything in the sutta, the earlier part as well as this part. Okay, so let us end with the sharing of the merits. Do we have the sheets? Okay, we just do the recitation. I'll just do the recitation. To share the merits with the devas, the bhutas, the fair spirits, wishing them to protect the world, to protect the teaching, to protect ourselves and others. Akasata chabhumata deva naga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu sasanang. Akasata chabhumata deva naga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu desanang. Akasata chabhumata deva naga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu mang parang. Etavatacha mehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe devanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. The short way. Sabbe bhutanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Sabbe satanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Bhavagopadaya avichihetato etantare satakayupapana rupya rupicha asanya sanyino dukha pamuchantu pusantu nibuting. Okay, we'll end with 3 half bows to the Buddha.